Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's presentation is on the War of 1812, oftentimes referred to by Americans as a second war of independence. The War of 1812 led to a short period in the United States history known as the Era of Good Feelings, and this was during the presidency of James Monroe. And this is a period in which there was effectively only one political party, as the Federalist Party had fractured and fallen apart. The Democratic Republicans remained the dominant party in the United States. But there were seeds of difference and contention, and the two-party system would emerge shortly thereafter, particularly as the Whig Party emerged as an opponent to the Democratic Republicans. So the War of 1812 is, as I mentioned in the previous slide, oftentimes referred to as a second war of independence. And the reason is largely because you have a new generation of American nationalism. You have the penning of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. You have Andrew Jackson, who becomes known as the hero of New Orleans, famous for his daring victory against the British in the Battle of New Orleans in early 1815, even though the battle in terms of the peace treaty and whatnot was completely insignificant because the peace treaty had already been signed. But nonetheless, it becomes a kind of symbolic image for Americans. William Henry Harrison, which maybe everybody knows Andrew Jackson from his service as president. William Henry Harrison, Old Tippecanoe, also became a very significant and iconic symbol of American nationalism during the 1800s. William Henry Harrison was most associated during the war with his leadership in the wars against the Shawnee Nation, led by Tecumseh. And this, of course, was an ally. They were, of course, an ally of the British, and William Henry Harrison helped lead to their defeat at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which gives Harrison the slogan or the nickname Old Tippecanoe, and he runs for the presidency in 1840 as Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler was his vice president. Of course, William Henry Harrison has the ultimate negative characterization that his presidency is also the shortest presidency in the history of American executives. He was president for 4 weeks. He gave his inauguration in a rainstorm without a jacket. He was old, he got pneumonia, and he died. Though Benjamin Harrison later, who is his grandson, becomes president in the late 1880s. So Harrison was part of a very significant group of nationalist figures at this time. There's also, in addition to what I'm going to say here, there's other important nationalist figures. John C. Calhoun, HenryClay, become some of the most significant nationalist figures at the beginning of the War of 1812, and then also emerging out of the War of 1812. It was groups like individuals, like Calhoun, like HenryClay, who agitated for war with Great Britain at the outset of the War of 1812. And afterwards, it is these individuals who would really be the primary drivers when it came to constructing the new nation. There were also, after the War of 1812, a new assurance of independence from Great Britain. It seemed that at this point, U.S. independence had truly been secured. In the 20 years prior to the War of 1812, the roughly 20 years, the United States had faced a tremendous amount of sort of bullying from the British and the French, particularly on the high seas, the impressment of sailors and so forth, and there was very much a sort of uneasiness about America's independence. After the war, U.S. independence is really secured for long term. The United States will advance its infrastructure, though it comes after the war, though it comes with a great deal of political fighting, as many Democratic Republicans opposed the use of federal funds to build canals and these types of things and roads. But nonetheless, figures like HenryClay, for example, helped to lead the development of infrastructure in the United States. And after the War of 1812, we have the construction of highly significant waterways like the Erie Canal. It's also a period in which we start to see a much more high-paced movement into the western territories of the United States as the Louisiana Purchase opens up huge areas for western migration. And expansion becomes something that many of the figures at this time believed was a safety valve to tensions over land, but ultimately expansion became a critical factor in creating political divisions in the United States that ultimately leads to the Civil War. We also have the United States asserting its right to Latin America with the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, which for over 100 years becomes an idea that suggested effectively that the United States had a right to kind of be a big brother overseeing Latin America. And during the early 20th century, this document, or this doctrine, I should say, was used to justify the United States landing troops in countries in Central America and the Caribbean numerous times in order to facilitate friendly governments, which were usually dictatorships, with American-sanctioned militaries that could provide economic and trade benefits to the United States and to U.S. corporations. So it's the dawning of a new America in a lot of ways. New nationalists, new symbols of nationalism, new kind of securing of freedom, a new movement west, and the construction of kind of a new era in the United States. The War of 1812 really had more than one facet to it. One facet was a frontier war that was being fought by the United States and a group known as the Shawnee Nation, Shawnee Confederation. And the Shawnees were led by Tecumseh and his brother, who is generally known as the Prophet. And Tecumseh is pictured here. The Shawnees were vehemently resisting the continued westward involvement of the United States and the damage that it was having on Native American culture. They denounced white man's culture. They denounced the basic, from the nature of dress to land ownership and so forth. They sought to resist the seeming forced assimilation of Westerners of their culture as more and more individuals moved into the western areas. And this time when we refer to the West, we're referring to the area of the Appalachian Mountains and the areas west of the Appalachian Mountains in parts of the Great Lakes and of Kentucky and of Tennessee and so forth. In 1811, before the War of 1812 had even begun, William Henry Harrison had defeated Tecumseh's brother, the Prophet, at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Later, Tecumseh goes on to fight with the British as the British aligned with Native Americans as a way of fighting the Americas during the War of 1812, and he is ultimately killed in the Battle of Thames, which is located in modern-day Canada. The War of 1812 between the British and the United States, the British and their Native American ally, and the United States was officially declared by the United States on June 1st, 1812. The question really is why. The United States, a small, upstart power, the British, the greatest imperial power of the world, why would the United States go to war with them? There was really three major factors in why the United States decided to go to war with Great Britain. And they extended back through the presidency of James Madison and in some respects through the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. Jefferson was president from 1801 until 1809, and of course Madison took the presidency in 1809. There were two very real foreign policy issues for the United States with the British. One was the issue of impressment. Impressment means to impress a sailor into service, means effectively to kidnap them, seize them, and forcibly put them into service for, in this case, the British Navy. The British were throughout the early 1800s impressing American sailors. They would board American merchant ships, and they would insist that an American seaman was actually British. They would kidnap them and force them into service for the British. The British was at this time dealing with Napoleon, and so they're fighting a war with Napoleon, and they have a manpower crisis, and this leads them to use impressment as a way of building that manpower by impressing American sailors into service. The British were also, in the lead up to the War of 1812, aligned with Native Americans, particularly the Shawnee Confederation in the Great Lakes region and the American West at the time, and this was leading to harassing battles and wars between western moving Americans and Native Americans. And of course, the first really major battle between the Shawnee Confederation and the United States occurred in 1811, before the War of 1812 began, and that was the Battle of Tippecanoe, which was fought in what is modern-day Indiana. And it's at this location that William Henry Harrison defeated the forces led by Tecumseh's brother, the Prophet. But this was a huge issue too. There's also a group of very passionate political figures, young political figures, particularly young figures representing areas of the more agrarian areas of the country, Kentucky, for example, areas of the South as well, who were known as the Warhawks. And the Warhawks were agitating for war with Britain. And the primary reason was because the Warhawks wanted to expand the territory of the United States, particularly for the purposes of expanding agrarian farm economics. So many rallied for war with Great Britain on the basis of annexing Canada. The annexation of Canada was a huge rallying cry for war during the War of 1812. There were others, though, too, who were rallying around the notion of annexing Spanish Florida, which was also another major aspect of this. So Warhawks were driven to a large degree not only by the actual issues in terms of impressment in the war with the Shawnee Confederation, but also in terms of seeking a land grab, effectively. They sought territory for the United States and an expansion of the agrarian economics of the United States at the time. Pictured here below is HenryClay of Kentucky, who was one of the most notable war hawks leading up to the War of 1812. He, along with John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Clay will become, as does Calhoun in respects, but Clay will become really one of the symbolic figures of the new generation of Americans during the first half of the 19th century. He was multiple times Speaker of the House, incredibly influential, and very famous, known as the Great Compromiser, very famous for his ability to continually lead compromises as the United States began to struggle over issues of expansion connected with issues of slavery. It's also important to note, as you see in the painting of James Madison of Virginia, Madison, the fourth president of the United States, had, like Jefferson, really struggled with how to deal with this situation when it came to British impressment of American sailors in the high seas. During Jefferson's presidency, Jefferson had kind of an ideal that America should be neutral and allowed to trade with basically whoever they wished. The problem with this was that as the United States tried to do this, they were entering into hostile waters that were, at war between the British and the French. The British were fighting Napoleon at this time, and it made Americans targets from both. In response to that, Jefferson's kind of total neutrality ideal, in response to that, Jefferson reacted in 1807 with something called the Embargo Act, in which effectively Jefferson cut off American trade from any European power, and effectively the United States effectively embargoed itself. And that was a hugely problematic decision to make, and it really displayed some of the difficulties that Jefferson had when it came to dealing with this particular issue of the struggle between the British and the French and its natural involvement of the United States. The result of the Embargo Act of 1807 was it it was designed to hurt the European economy and force them to, you know, stop their activities of impressing American sailors. But actually what it did is it hurt the American economy much more. And particularly in the Northeast. The Northeast was a central shipping area for the United States. It was also a Federalist bastion at this time. And the Northeast became incredibly angry over this, that a Virginia president would, in Thomas Jefferson, would effectively take such an action that almost destroyed the economy of Federalist-held New England. And so, you know, in the lead up to the war, there was a real kind of polarization of politics in America where, you know, Southern and Western, more agrarian-oriented individuals were clamoring for war, for territory, and New England Federalists were absolutely angry. They opposed war. They wanted to trade, particularly with Great Britain, and they were very upset by policies taken, particularly by Jefferson, the Embargo Act, that caused great economic difficulties for them. And in some cases, there were even groups in New England that suggested seceding from the Union during this time. So these are the primary issues at heart, particularly difficulty with dealing with the impressment crisis, difficulty in dealing with aid to Native Americans on the West, and the clamoring voice of Warhawks, who were influential on the decision making of James Madison. The War of 1812 was initiated first with a three-pronged Canadian strategy that focused on the areas around Detroit, Niagara, and Lake Champlain. To a large degree, many of the wars in the War of 1812 were naval battles that occurred on areas like the Great Lakes. And here you see in this painting an iconic painting of the Battle of Lake Erie, in which Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British fleet. This is, again, we're talking about the War of 1812 as a symbol, a new symbol of American nationalism. Oliver Hazard Perry depicted here much in the same kind of way that you might think about George Washington crossing the Delaware. When Perry defeated this fleet on Lake Erie, the result was to cut off the Native Americans fighting with Tecumseh from supplies from the British, and it facilitated Tecumseh's defeat at the Battle of Thames in 1813. Now, at this time in 1812, when the United States were aiming at this three-pronged strategy to basically seize Canada, the British were distracted. They were still dealing with Napoleon. Napoleon, who had invaded Russia in 1812, Napoleon was facing his defeat, but the British were still distracted in 1812 and 1813. And we see that once Napoleon is taken care of, during his first exile, the British exert more of a focus on the United States and actually attempt an invasion of the United States that resulted in the burning of America's capital. After Napoleon is defeated for the first time and exiled to the island of Elba after his invasion of Russia, the British kind of focused more intensely on the campaign with the United States, and the British launched an attempted invasion in which they attack up through the Chesapeake, and they attack down towards Lake Champlain. The American colonists, wow, listen to me. The Americans were quite fortunate that Thomas MacDonough scored an incredible victory in September of 1814 on the water Lake Champlain near Plattsburgh. That victory really saved New York from the British capturing the city and really helped to negotiate peace talks, which were beginning to get underway in the latter stages of 1814. The British in this invasion in August of 1814 burned Washington. Baltimore held, but of course this is where Francis Scott Key penned the Star-Spangled Banner. Later, of course, Andrew Jackson will win the victory at the Battle of New Orleans, as is depicted in this painting here. But the treaty was already made when Andrew Jackson did that. The peace talks had begun, and the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium, in which John Quincy Adams, the former or the future president of the United States, resulted in an armistice and basically a return to the status quo prior to the war. There was not even any mention, by the way, of the original grievances. The United States, which had demanded that the British cease impressment, there was actually no mention of it at the actual peace talks. So the Treaty of Ghent really winds up being in agreement by the two to stop fighting and to go back to more or less the way it was before. So it was hardly a victory for the Americans, though it was not a defeat. So the results of the War of 1812, obviously 6,000 dead, but a creation of new symbols of nationalism, new icons. William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson, the Star-Spangled Banner. There's a redrawing of the District of Columbia. There's a new kind of feeling of America entering a new era and a new push to expand the country by moving west. There is a new push to modernize the infrastructure of the United States too, as the young country is at the fore of early industrialism. And this was during the era of good feelings, which is generally this era for about 10 years, about 1815 to 1823 or so, particularly during the presidency of James Monroe, in which there was only one political party. But there were still fundamental divisions that would lead to the two-party system emerging very quickly after. HenryClay of Kentucky kind of is an example of this. HenryClay, who was a Warhawk before the war and becomes really one of the most famous political figures during the period of the first half of the 1800s and the lead up to the Civil War. HenryClay proposed, he becomes known as the Great Compromiser, he proposed a program he called the American System. And this was to use the United States Bank and to raise tariffs to protect American industry by raising tariffs on imported goods, to create public works projects, funding by the U.S. Bank, to create roads and canals through federal subsidies. So he had an idea of using the federal government to really protect industry and to build the type of infrastructure that would interconnect the country and help the country modernize as an early industrial power. The United States does use tariffs to protect its industry, but the idea of using the U.S. Bank to fund a wide array of public works projects like roads and canals was more controversial, and that is not as successful at this time. And ideas like that become critical components of a new political party that develops in this period known as the Whigs. And the Whig Party, which will be particularly significant in the 1830s and the 1840s, the Whig Party largely promotes using the federal government and a U.S. bank to build infrastructure improvements and these types of things. And so at this time, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, there's too many opponents who believe that the federal government and the U.S. bank using this kind of power was a degree of power that they were uncomfortable with from the federal authorities. And so they felt it was down to states to fund this. And some states do better than others. New York State was exceptionally important at this time as New York State constructs the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal was significant because the Erie Canal connected effectively the area around Albany and New York City in commerce to the Great Lakes, which through other canals and through the Ohio and the Mississippi River actually connected New Orleans. And so with the Erie Canal's completion in the 1820s, you see the construction of an infrastructure that through steam power and steamboats could interconnect the world and connect the southern economy, the southern cotton economy, which was being revolutionized by the cotton gin, to the industrial sectors in the north where most of the textile factories were. So a new era for the United States.